Welcome to today's SIEPR Associates meeting. I'm Mark Duggan, the director of the Stanford Institute for Economic Policy Research, and I'm thrilled that so many of you are tuning in to today's event featuring Larry Hershfield and Peter Ingram from Hawaiian Airlines. In honor of this event, I've pulled out my One Aloha shirt and have been flooded with positive memories of my second ever trip to Hawaii less than 2 years ago. So I'm really excited to talk about Hawaii today. Love Hawaii. This is our first event since we broadcast the SIEPR Economic Summit last month. And we've been spotlighting a lot of terrific policy relevant research since then. You can check out our website at siepr.stanford.edu to read about our senior fellows and faculty fellows' work on the impact of voting by mail, getting more people to take advantage of the earned income tax credit, and lessons learned from paid family leave policies, and much, much more. I've been trying to get out there writing op-eds and speaking to reporters and California policymakers about our state's need to reform its unemployment insurance program, which some of you may have seen, and have joined forces with other members of the SIEPR family in other parts of the US on these topics too, for programs in other states as well. All of this work is really relevant to policy discussions happening today in Washington, DC, in Sacramento, elsewhere in the US, and really all around the world. And I'm incredibly grateful to so many of you who support what we're doing here at SIEPR. And again, I'm really delighted that you're joining us today for what I know is going to be a really interesting conversation with the leaders of Hawaiian Airlines. As I'm sure you know, the airline industry has been especially hard hit by the pandemic, as have tourism-dependent areas like Hawaii. So many of us have been anxious and eager to travel this past year, and I'm hopeful that with more people getting vaccinated and as COVID cases hopefully continue to go down, more of us will be booking trips for both fun and work in the weeks and months ahead. And I'm sure that Hawaii will be a top destination for a lot of people. But there's no getting around the fact that this year has been absolutely brutal for the airlines. While things have gotten better during the past several months, things are not nearly where they were 14 months ago overall. This matters not only for the many pilots, flight attendants, and other airline employees, but also for the industries like hotels and restaurants that depend so much on travelers. Estimates suggest that airlines drive nearly $2 trillion in economic activity just here in the US, and more than 10 million jobs here as well. And I'm truly honored to have Larry and Peter with us today to give us a better sense of the magnitude of the disruption that's happened, and also share their thoughts on how strong the recovery will be in the weeks ahead. I'm going to give each of them a very brief introduction, and after their presentation, we're going to have some time for some Q&A. I encourage you to submit your questions through the link on your screens. You don't have to wait until the Q&A time. You can, if you have them during the presentation, feel free to send them in. And I'll try to get to as many of them as I can later on in today's session. Or you can use the link that came with your event invitations. Either way should work. So let me start off with, first, Larry Hershfield has been the chairman of the Hawaiian Airlines Board of Directors since July 2004. He served as the president and CEO of Hawaiian from June 2004 through June 2005. Since 2002, Larry has been the CEO of Ranch Capital, which he founded to pursue investments in undervalued or distressed assets or companies. He served as chairman of the board of Premier Entertainment Biloxi, which owned the Hard Rock Hotel and Casino in Biloxi, Mississippi. And he serves as an advisor to Berkadia, a commercial real estate, brokerage, mortgage banking, and loan servicing firm that is majority owned by Berkshire Hathaway and Jefferies. And Larry is definitely not a stranger to Stanford. He earned his MBA here and served as a trustee of the Stanford Business School Trust. He's also been on the advisory board of the Stanford Center on Longevity. Next up, we have Peter Ingram. He is the president and chief executive officer for both Hawaiian Airlines and its parent company, Hawaiian Holdings. He joined Hawaiian as the company's CFO in 2005 and served as executive VP and chief commercial officer from 2011 through 2018. Before Hawaiian, Peter spent 11 years with the AMR Corporation, the parent company of American Airlines and American Eagle Airlines, and he also served as American Eagle's vice president of finance and their CFO. Ingram earned his MBA from Duke's Fuqua School of Business, and he graduated with honors from the University of Western Ontario. So thank you so much for being with us today, both Larry and Peter, and I'm going to turn things over to you, and I believe Larry's going to start off.
Yeah, thanks, Mark, and thanks very much for having us today. Are you going to run the slides so I know what they're?
Yeah, we're going to have some slides. So I think yeah, we've got someone who's going to put them up. Yeah, great.
There we go. So go ahead and switch that, please. Next one. So the airline industry has a long long, well-earned reputation for being a very difficult one. I had a quote. Let me see if I can get this thing to work. Warren Buffett in 2007 made what's now become quite a famous quote when talking about airlines, when he said, if you want to become a millionaire, start as a billionaire and buy an airline. And then he went on to say in his 2007 annual report, the worst sort of business is one that grows rapidly, requires significant capital to engender the growth, and then earns little or no money. Think airlines. And as this chart shows, there are a bunch of reasons why the airline industry is quite difficult, easy to get into, very capital intensive, very people intensive, highly regulated. And since deregulation in 1979, on the right here, you see the industry's barely broken even. And I think when you compare it to most other airline industries as we group them, it's the worst performer over this long period. And what people sometimes don't realize is that airlines do sometimes fail. But when that happens, the airplanes simply move to another airline, or the airline emerges as a lower cost, more competitive carrier. And so while airlines fail, it doesn't really make the industry perform better because capacity rarely leaves. You can go ahead and change the chart. Go forward, please. So while the industry's been quite difficult, the consumers benefited mightily. As you can see on the left here, the real cost of an airline trip has about halved since deregulation, and the availability to the general population, the availability and cost of travel has made it way more affordable. And as you can see, it's now something that has been democratized and is available to just about everybody in the world because of the competitiveness and the way costs have come down. Go ahead, please. So despite the fact that the airline industry is so difficult, it doesn't mean there aren't good opportunities. This is just a quick review of my involvement. In 2005, when Hawaiian was in bankruptcy, we invested $187 million to fund the company's emergence. And as with all investing, price matters a lot. Our average cost was a little over $4 a share. And as you can see from this chart, price rose gradually for 10 years or so, and then really took off a few years back and actually peaked at around 60. Today, Hawaiian trades in the mid to high 20s in this era of COVID, but nonetheless, it turned out to be quite a good investment. Brief history of the airline. We started in 1929 as an inter-island carrier. We started flying from the islands to the mainland in 1960. Hawaiian filed its first bankruptcy in 1994, emerged, did fairly well in the 90s, but then after 9/11 was forced back into bankruptcy in 2003. And then, as I said, my company funded them emerging in 2005. And then from there on, we basically worked to try and grow and improve the company. And we'll just talk a bit about that. The story of how we worked through the company in bankruptcy is an interesting one. I'm not going to talk about it unless someone has questions, but it was quite a fun experience. Next slide, please. So since emerging, we've focused hard on growing and changing and improving the airline in these general areas, as this chart mentions. Some of the things on here read kind of easy, but are actually kind of scary. For example, this chart says we needed to find the optimal fleet for the mission. What that meant in practice was in 2008, when Hawaiian had no cash, really no borrowing capacity, and had a market value of less than $300 million, the board and management committed over $1 billion to buy equipment so that we could refleet from 767s to A330s with really no idea how we're going to pay for it. Turned out to be an important decision and allowed us to move forward and do what we do today, but at the time was kind of a bet the company decision. Next slide, please. This chart shows the results from 2010, I think if you went back to 2005, it'd be even more dramatic. Shows that prior to COVID in 2020, which certainly threw a wrench into the works, things were going quite well. Margin improved dramatically, as did our return on capital. A few other figures comparing the company in 2005 when we emerged to the company in 2019, the year before COVID. We increased revenues from 500 million to about 2.8 billion. In 2005, we lost about $15 million. 2019, our net income was almost 225 million. Our employee base grew from about 3,300 to almost 7,500. And our fleet went from 25 aircraft to 66 today. That was 2019. That I got to cover sort of the wonderful growth years. I'll now turn it over to Peter, who gets to talk about what's happened in 2020 with COVID and what the future looks like.
Thanks, Larry. So Larry's right. We had a lot of momentum, particularly in the back half of the last decade. You can go on to the next slide. All of that momentum was really stopped in its tracks last year at the end of the first quarter. And the two images you see here are what is normally a bustling heart of Waikiki here in Honolulu. That was completely empty, and a ticket lobby at Honolulu Airport, where we have our main base of operations, that at peak times is a complete mass of humanity. And you see this was taken in the middle of the day, and in probably April or May last year, at the depth of the inactivity we had. In Hawaii, our experience has been somewhat different from the rest of the U.S. mainland. We really didn't have the early spike that existed in California or in New York, but seeing cases rise on the U.S. mainland, and out of concern for the impact that a spike would have on public health here in Hawaii, the state acted really proactively to institute a 14-day quarantine for any out-of-state traveler on March 26th of last year, and then a quarantine for all travel within the islands on April 1st. We had already seen a rapid turnaround in booking activity. In fact, bookings at that point and our revenue had gone negative. So we were refunding more revenue from advanced purchase tickets than we were taking in bookings, and bookings themselves actually slowed to a virtual stop. What started as a gradual pulling bits of the schedule down, when that quarantine went into effect and we knew that there would be almost no travel at all, we really pulled down our schedule to a absolute skeleton of what we formerly flew. We were for a while only operating 3 daily trips to the U.S. mainland, one to Los Angeles, one to San Francisco, one to Seattle. Those were carrying, frankly, more revenue below the floor of the cabin in cargo than they were in terms of passenger. Any passenger traffic was really just essential travel. And we were flying a minimal schedule from Honolulu to Maui, Kona, Hilo, and Lihue here within the islands, again, mainly for essential travel, people who needed to travel for public works or public health care. About 95% of our revenue disappeared. And while we could reduce some of the variable costs by not flying, the fixed costs all continued. And so we were rapidly burning cash on a daily basis, and really had to.
You may want to use some of the slides, I think, might tell the story, because I think we're stuck on.
We'll go ahead. Beyond ourselves, I would say it also has a dramatic impact on Hawaii. So there's normally about 250,000 people here in the islands from out of state, and they're an important part of our tax base and consumer spending. Here you see just that dramatic drop in terms of what it did to traffic. And not only does it drop off a cliff there in April, but it really stays flat through until October. So we really didn't see any recovery after April and May on a material basis as the quarantine remained in effect. We've started now to see some recovery as we've moved past October, and the turning point in October was implementing pre-travel testing as an alternative to quarantine and giving people some opportunity to keep going. Go ahead to the next one. Here you see what that has meant for us in terms of some of the COVID statistics themselves. On the one hand, we have had, as I said, a better experience than the rest of the US. We've really never seen surges on the same level on a per capita basis. Our deaths have remained lower despite a somewhat older population. So from a public health perspective, this can be considered a positive, certainly. But as you go to the next slide, you see that one of the consequences of that is we went from having among, if not the lowest unemployment rates in the entire country to immediately in April last year having the highest. And we continue to have a sustained higher unemployment rate, hovering now at around 10%, as all of the activity around the tourism industry remains somewhat subdued, even as we sit here today. And if you go to the next slide, one of the things that this really highlighted about the economic reality of Hawaii is that in some respect, almost every business is a tourism business. And Love's here, though I'm focusing on this slide, Love's is a bakery that has operated within Hawaii until the end of last month for 170 years. And Love's has shut down. And you might think, why is a bakery a victim of a pandemic when people were certainly continuing to eat? And in addition to that loaf of white bread that you see right there, Love's would provide a lot of baked goods for the hotels that would serve our visitors. And those tended to be some of their higher margin offerings. And obviously that business was gone. And ultimately they succumbed under the weight of the economic downturn. The same story goes for hotels, obviously restaurants, but even industries like agriculture. Most of the agriculture that we have in Hawaii is producing food for the hotel sector, more so than it is producing mass volumes of agriculture. That's not a business that Hawaii participates in much anymore. And so various sectors that you may not think of as being tourist related prove to be heavily tourism related. Go ahead to the next slide, and we'll talk a little bit about how we're recovering out of this. I talked about pre-travel testing on October 15th. We're really an experiment on how you open up with protocols that continue to maintain some of the safety that we had with the quarantine, but while allowing economic activity to begin to recover. And we were one of the first places to strictly enforce requiring a test to be able to travel. Our business recognized that one of the things that was going to be difficult was how people get accessibility to those tests. And if you think about October and November, when that second surge was really hitting the US mainland, having access to a test was something that was not always available for people. And we needed to have people be able to get it within a narrow 72-hour window. So the shipping container with the lovely paint job you see on the right of the screen is actually a COVID testing lab. And we partnered with a company called Worksite Labs to put testing locations in key departure points for us. There's one near the airport in San Francisco. There's one in Los Angeles. We are shipping test kits from other locations. We've now got access in a variety of places. So in addition to partnering with other third-party providers of testing, mainly ones who didn't do clinical testing, so we weren't infringing on the supply for medical purposes, we've been able to create an ability for people to have access to the test to let them access the Hawaii vacation they want. Go ahead to the next one. Our focus, as you know, we started through this, one of the things that has been most challenging about COVID was how much we didn't know early on. The vast majority of our focus early on was on surface transmission because we didn't know how the disease was spreading. We obviously put in place lots of things like plexiglass in our airports, enhanced the cleaning procedures with photostatic or electrostatic fogging on our aircraft, really paid a lot of attention. One of the remarkable things, in fact, is that as we've come to know that the disease spread more on an airborne basis, or almost entirely on an airborne basis, airplanes are actually incredibly safe, because the air flows from top to bottom. It's recycled multiple times an hour. Fresh air is introduced from the outside, and anything that that is recirculated goes through hospital-grade HEPA air filters. And all of that, thankfully, was in place before we even began this period. Move on to the next one. Another focus for us was on raising money. And in our case, we've raised about $2.1 billion since the pandemic began. There was some important support in the first part of this chart from the federal government through the CARES Act, and subsequently some of the other relief bills to provide payroll support to airlines so that we could keep people on board and trained and be ready to support the economy in a recovery. But most of what we've done has been private markets. We had another over $450 million through financing aircraft. We were fortunate to have used the positive financial performance of the last decade to have a strong financial condition coming into this. So we had assets that were available. And then earlier this year, we did a $1.2 billion financing backed by the cash flows of our loyalty program that really has put us in a position now where we've taken the question of, do we have adequate liquidity to manage through the end of this process off the table? And now we're able to focus entirely on what we need to do to serve our guests and to win the recovery. Go ahead to the next one. So as we think about that, what we're thinking about is moving forward, safely reopening tourism, making sure that we can take care of our employees and our guests and bring people back to the experience. We know that there is a lot of demand, and we're already seeing that, especially in the early part of this year. Sustainability is something that's going to be very important for us going forward. This has a variety of meanings. The reason people love coming to Hawaii is because it is a beautiful natural environment, and it's really important for us to preserve that. We also recognize that we operate in an industry where we are going to be consuming fossil fuels for a long period of time. It's one of the hardest parts of the economy to decarbonize, and we know that one of the really important things we have to work on over the next many years is how we minimize that impact, reduce it, and ultimately drive to eliminating it with new technology over time. We've actually, somewhat paradoxically, we've opened 3 new markets since the beginning of the pandemic in the early part of this year, and we'll open a 4th in a couple of weeks when I'll be putting on my cowboy boots with my Aloha shirt and flying to Austin, Texas on our first flight to Austin. This is recognizing the fact that there is demand. There are places that are growing, and some of the places that we've traditionally flown are not necessarily going to have the breadth of demand that they did previously. And so it's an opportunity to try some of the things that we've been looking at for a while. And we've got to continue to invest in our facilities, invest in our aircraft, provide people with a great experience, because that guest service is really what has positioned us well in the past. And I think it's going to become more important in the future as people really look for positive experiences. Go ahead to the last one. We've obviously been through a lot. I could talk for hours and hours and hours about some of the experiences of the past year. But having been through that long, dark night, more so than at any time in a while, I really feel we're at the beginning of brighter days ahead. We are seeing a recovery as we go through this year. People do want to travel, and we can provide that service safely and with great hospitality. And we are looking forward to a much better year in 2021 than the difficult times we had in 2020. With that, I'll wrap it up, and Mark, I guess turn it back over to you, see if we have any questions.
Yeah, no, that's great. Thanks so much to both of you. That was super interesting. And Peter, you mentioned a new route to Austin, Texas. We hear a lot about Austin, Texas here in Silicon Valley because, big titans of technology and industry talking about moving there and so forth. So we hear, so it's not a surprise. When you said we're going to a new market, I thought, I'll bet it's going to be Austin, Texas. And Austin they've had some swagger lately.
We are counting on, in fact, having not flown to Texas ever before. One of the things we're counting on is that there's an awareness of Hawaiian Airlines, because people have moved from the Bay Area, and that's an important market that we'd like to tap into.
Super interesting. And then also you mentioned about the sustainability issues in Hawaii. So at Stanford, there's lots more interest in sustainability. There's going to be a new school of sustainability. So I was thinking I might propose a pilot research project for me to travel to Hawaii for many months and study sustainability issues in Hawaii. But in any case, okay, so here we are, we're at SIEPR, Stanford Institute for Economic Policy Research. One question I want to start on, an economic policy type question, and you sort of touched on it a bit in your remarks, and I'm not sure if you or Larry want to take this, but the federal government has approved a total now of about $54 billion in aid to US airlines since March of last year. And you alluded a little bit to it with the CARES Act, but can you just kind of walk us through how that support has helped your airline, your employees, your customers, and so forth? Like how do you think about the big picture? And I think there have been different parts of it, CARES Act, American Rescue Plan, and so forth.
Yeah, the most important part has been something called the Payroll Support Program, which is you can think of it as the airline version of the PPP, to put it in terms that people who aren't familiar with our industry would be familiar with. And what that did was provided us with a mix of grants and loans in return for committing to keep our employees on the payroll. And that's been helpful to us, particularly early on. It was just important from a financing perspective when the capital markets were a little bit more frozen in April and May of last year. And we just wanted to make sure we were securing the liquidity to manage through the next few months. That's not so much a concern anymore now that the private markets have become more accessible. But keeping people employed is important for us, because you can't just shut down an airline and then start it up overnight if people have fallen out of training. Pilots need to have a certain number of takeoffs and landings, either in a simulator or on an airplane. Mechanics need to be current on their training. And so it was important to us to maintain employment through this period, and obviously important to our people as well, to be able to maintain employment and not be going on the employment roll. So that's been a very helpful piece for us. And frankly, that's the primary piece that the airlines have accessed. Most of us with private markets available are now not going to access another loan program that was part of the CARES Act, or we've already repaid the small amount that we drew on that.
Great, thanks so much for that. And also I'm getting some great questions from the audience. I have some of my own, so I'm going to kind of alternate, I think, back and forth between some of mine and those from the audience. So and if you're watching, please do feel free to send in questions. So I understand the lockdown in Hawaii was relatively strict. And so I'm curious as to your take. Do you think the state got it right in terms of its restrictiveness? And I think it's possible, I was reading a bit in preparation for today, that the policy, there's not just a one policy for all of Hawaii. There may be different policies in, let's say, Oahu, then in Maui, and so forth. So can you talk a little bit about that issue?
Yeah, I'll touch on both those. In terms of did the state get the policy right, I think it's really hard to second guess what happened at the beginning of the pandemic, because there was so much uncertainty and people were making decisions, whether it was us as corporate leaders making decisions, whether it was public policy makers. And I think the state took a more cautious approach than some other jurisdictions, but reflecting the fact that the healthcare resources are less here, the number of emergency rooms and intensive care beds and ventilators was lower. I think there was a real desire not to get behind the 8 ball, and we were successful in that. So that's good. I do think on the recovery, sometimes we've been a little slower, and there have been opportunities. We proved that by instituting testing in October. I think that could have been in place months earlier and being able to start to stimulate a little bit of economic recovery in a safe, careful method. And we've probably been a little slow on the mark on that and a little tight on restrictions. You mentioned the differences between islands. That's been another challenge for us, and challenge for people who are planning a trip out here, is each of the islands have had, then each of the main islands in Hawaii is represented by a different county. So we've got county mayors who have put restrictions in that are unique to their islands for what are legitimate reasons in many cases, but it has created a patchwork of regulation that is just confusing for the consumer that's not here all the time, who is planning a trip, and they don't know where they have to get a test, which test providers are available, what's going to be required when they get here. And so making it a little bit more confusing has been a challenge that we've tried to work through, and we've tried to bridge the gap in terms of giving information to people, making sure we're filling that information gap so that people aren't confused and aren't frustrated by the experience.
Great. Thanks so much for that. And I have a question here from the audience that is interesting. So what is the outlook for the return of Japanese tourism to Hawaii? And is Hawaiian Airlines working with the Japanese and US governments to implement changes to current international travel restrictions? And just like before you get into that, can you give us a sense of how big Japan loomed in terms of your business pre-COVID?
Yeah, for us, Japan is the biggest international market by far for travel to Hawaii. Overall, in 2019, we had about 11 million visitors to the state. About 1.6 million of those were Japanese. So call it roughly 15%. And likely in terms of the amount of money they spend, because they spend more per capita when they're here in Hawaii, that a more important percentage than that of the overall visitor economy in Hawaii. So Japanese travel is very important. It remains dormant right now. We are flying to Japan a couple of times a week to Tokyo and Osaka. Like when we operated those flights to the mainland in the second quarter of last year, more of the revenue or most of the revenue on that airplane now is cargo that's coming from Asia and then transiting on to the US mainland. And the challenge there is that someone coming from Japan, and our SVP of sales will be making this trip in a little bit. So I've been going over his plans with him. He'll have to take 3 separate PCR tests to travel. One to enter Hawaii, one before traveling back to Japan, and another one shortly after his return in Japan. And those tests in Japan will probably cost about $200. So economically, it's just very difficult. Japan is just going back in some of the main cities into a state of emergency with restrictions, and so we're uncertain right now what the prospect for recovery there is. Unfortunately, I think it is moving a little further to the right and likely to be well into the back half of the year before we see a real robust recovery. But I'm encouraged by how quickly the pent-up demand has turned into people wanting to buy tickets from the US mainland as soon as conditions began to improve. And I think with the historic affinity that the Japanese have for Hawaii, we're going to see a pretty rapid recovery when that is available to people. But right now, it's just really at a very early and minimal stage.
Great, thanks so much for that, Peter. And so just building on that a little bit, you put up this quite remarkable figure, which showed the US unemployment rate over time, which I've seen. Basically, we went from slightly under 4% to 14.7% in the course of a month or two. But for Hawaii, it was an even bigger change, like 2.5% to 22%, like basically overnight. And, you know, as you pointed out, it is still true that Hawaii has the nation's highest unemployment rate, but it's come down a lot from that high. It's now down around between 9 and 10%, as you mentioned. How optimistic would you say the residents and businesses there are about how things are going to unfold in the months ahead? And, you know, how about you? And you touched on this a little bit, but just, you know, obviously Hawaii is probably more tourism dependent than any state in the US. And it is somewhat right. And the airline industry matters, especially because unlike other states, you know, California needs a lot of tourism, but people can drive from Arizona or Oregon or what have you. So just your thoughts on that, on the general level of optimism?
Yeah, I think people are encouraged economically by how much recovery we have seen, and really since the end of January when bookings started to pick up. I think, you know, in terms of visitor arrivals per day, we have had some days where we've been around 20,000 arrivals on a, you know, peak times that would be 30 to 35. So that's a substantial recovery from where we were. I think people still need to see that international piece of the puzzle come back before it's fully back. And the hotels are starting to respond now, though, and bringing people back. Restaurants and bars are able to bring people back. So all of those service industry jobs are beginning to recover now. I think what is really tragic from an economic standpoint is we've lost some businesses forever. You know, mom and pop restaurants that have been around for generations, independent bars and restaurants. I mentioned Love's earlier, and some of those unfortunately will never come back. And you know, often they've been you know, pillars of the community for decades, and they're definitely going to be missed.
That's great. I mean, not great, obviously, that they're going out. Thanks for that insight, though. But it's very it's sad to think about all of the companies. And I don't think we still have very good data on how much how many businesses are temporarily out or versus out for the long run. But
Mark, one thing one interesting point about Hawaii is, as important as tourism is, and Peter can speak to this more than I can, for the locals, it's kind of a mixed bag. And so they sort of both love and hate tourists. I think for a lot of folks who live in Hawaii, this has been the best year ever. No traffic, no rude people, and so forth. So but on a serious note, it's an important question for us and for the state as to what the appropriate number of visitors are, because you get too many and it does diminish the experience. And Hawaii is not unique in that. I think other places in Europe, like Capri, for example, have the same kind of issue. So it is a bit of a schizophrenic kind of a situation in the state, I think.
Right. Yeah, that's really interesting, that angle. Right. The absence of traffic, I think, has been one of the, I guess the extent there are any silver linings of this, but in Bay Area, I used to hear a lot about how crazy the traffic was around here, and it is obviously subsided, although it's coming back now for sure. But it's very interesting in Hawaii that sort of somewhat different view depending on your perspective. So I want to take a question from one of our virtual attendees, which is for either or both of you. In terms of public policy, what is your policy recommendation for maintaining a healthy and sustainable U.S. airline industry, assuming that's a proper policy objective? Because you hear that sometimes about the auto industry, for example, the U.S. auto industry. We want to have, so in any case, but for the airline industry, what thoughts on that?
So I'll take a shot, and then again, Peter, I'm sure, has opinions. So in fact, Peter and I talked about this a bit before the call. I think with respect to the industry, one thing that is important is for the federal government to recognize the challenges that smaller carriers face vis-a-vis the big four, call it. And in particular today, at airports, it's often difficult for a carrier like Hawaiian to maintain its presence in a way we'd like to, because of the power of the big guys and the financial wherewithal they have. And so I think some folks might say there's been over concentration in the airline industry with some of the mergers that were allowed. I'm not sure I'm taking that position right now, but I think it is important that the federal government recognize that smaller airlines, and by that I mean even airlines as large as Alaska and JetBlue, certainly Hawaiian, are able to compete effectively and are not just priced, or that the power of the big guys doesn't drive us out. The other point that's important, obviously, is this whole sustainability argument. Objective for airlines is important. It's a big one. Airlines, as we said earlier, are relatively low margin operations. It's hard, or probably impossible, for any single airline to develop the right technologies going forward. I think Airbus and Boeing will work on that, but it's important that we partner with the government on trying to do that in a way that gets it where we need to be without making it financially impossible for the airlines.
Yeah, I'll just add to that, to those points. Larry showed in his slides how the consumers in the United States have benefited incredibly from lower cost travel since deregulation, and maintaining that the smaller airlines like us and like the Alaskas and JetBlues and Spirits that provide somewhat different business models are a really important competitive governor on the four largest carriers, and really is important for us to have the ability to compete effectively going forward. I think having to the question of, does it make sense for the government to have policies to make sure that we have a successful, thriving airline sector? I think it absolutely is important. There are incredible benefits to the connectivity that we provide. Before the pandemic, we were more able to connect with other people and other cultures and other countries than at any point in human history. And I think that has incredible benefits in terms of our understanding of our world and ourselves. And so it's exciting for us to play a part in that. And I think it is important, not just for the economic benefits, but really for the societal benefits that that a healthy, thriving airline industry can provide. And the environmental points Larry made are very well taken. This is something that, as we've spent the last 12 months making sure we can survive a pandemic that has always been looming out there as one of the big challenges we need to face going forward. I said it in my remarks that ours will be one of the hardest economic sectors globally to decarbonize, because the technology right now does not exist to fly an airplane from Hawaii to the Western US or to Asia without burning fossil fuels. But there is, I've got great belief in what technology can do over time, and it will take decades. But I think we've got to partner with other industries. We've got to partner with governments on research to make sure we're doing what we can to reduce the environmental impact of our sector.
This is great. So thanks for that. And I'm going to ask a question that both from me and from an audience virtual attendee. How do you think about, so about 2 years ago, I think it's March 23rd, 2019, Southwest started flying to Hawaii from California. So has that affected your business? And if so, how, was my question. And then from the audience, and what what do you think about the long-term impact of Southwest?
We didn't notice that. Go ahead, Peter. Why don't you take that one?
Southwest.
You know, we have we're no strangers to competition, and particularly from the Western U.S. If you look at places like Los Angeles and the Bay Area, we have had a variety of competitors, all of the big network carriers. Alaska is a big provider of service to Hawaii. Over time, we've had ultra low cost carriers like Allegiant or ATA when they were in existence. So in many respects, Southwest is just another in the long list of competitors that we have had. Obviously, they're one of the biggest airlines in the country. They've got an incredibly, I would love to have their mailing list and their frequent flyer list to be able to market to. But we've proven over time that we can be very successful at competing for travelers to, from, and within Hawaii, because we really focus on doing that better than anyone else. Our one thing is something that we're focused on doing better than anyone else. And I think we've got a great competitive model. Obviously, supply and demand, there's people with an economic background involved. We can't change the laws of supply and demand. So when more supply comes into the market, it does put pressure on prices. But we think we've got a great customer proposition, and we are keen to get back to actually having demand to compete for, and getting back into that business now.
I would just say on that point that and I'm really tooting the horn of the management team, which I have not much to do with, but we are very Hawaii centric. Every flight we have originates or terminates in the islands, and our whole business model is centered around the whole Hawaii experience and the importance of aloha. And we don't just say, we really try to build it into our product and build it into our culture. And so we offer a very different product than most of our competitors. Peter's right. When more capacity comes in, pricing is affected, and we have to compete on price. But we feel very proud of the product we offer and the people we have offering it. We think it's a great experience for our customers.
Great, thanks to you both. Another question here from one of our attendees. Can you comment a bit on the viability of service providers to the airlines, food service, cleaning services, even the airports themselves? Are you seeing any closing of these essential services?
We have not at this point. Obviously, there are absolutely downstream effects, and I think as challenges in the industry linger in certain pockets, we will probably see some of it. On the airport side, ultimately where the effects are largely going to be felt is in terms of higher costs getting passed through onto the users, because airports typically have natural monopolies and a great competitive position based on their geography, and ultimately our guests pay for that through the ticket prices that go to fund rent and landing fees at the airports. I think the Airbus and Boeing and GE and Pratt and Whitney, those companies will all be fine, and they have more diversified business than just their commercial airline or commercial engine businesses. But they will certainly feel effects. I worry a little bit more about those smaller, whether it's catering providers or retailers in airports. There will be retail in airports. It may not be the same people that were there before. And so those are some of the places that could face more difficulty coming back and recovering as demand recovers.
I might add, I'm not sure it's widely known, but in addition to airlines getting aid from the federal government, I'm pretty sure airports did as well. And so the airports, I think, will probably be fine.
Okay, that's good to hear. And so I think you sort of bucketed I can't remember which one of you it was, but sort of bucketed your business into three categories, from the mainland US, from international, and then within Hawaii. And so you talked a bit about the international has clearly not come back. Mainland US has come back pretty well. But this question from one of our virtual attendees: has inter-island travel come back? And is it significant? Is it sort of back where it was, or is it sort of between those two extremes that you outlined?
Yeah, it's sort of between those two. And there's a couple of reasons why we haven't seen a more robust recovery there. One of them is that as of right now, we still require a PCR test to travel on an inter-island flight without quarantine, and we know quarantines pretty much stifle all demand. We've proven that point over the last year. The test, well, it hasn't been as much an impediment for long haul. Having a $100 to $150 PCR test in the context of the full cost of a long haul airline ticket, several days of accommodation, is a smaller percentage increment than getting a $150 test so you can have the privilege of buying a $49 ticket to go visit your auntie in Hilo. And so we're seeing a little less than half of our neighbor island business has recovered right now. It has picked up gradually. A lot of it is connections off long haul, but that was only about 25% of our business. And so what's really going to unlock that is when, and this is something we've advocated for, that we think it is time for this already, we lift the restrictions on travel within the state, which were really predicated on having a higher incidence of the disease here on Oahu, which is not the case anymore. Oahu is much more in line at a very manageable level with the rest of the state in terms of new cases. And so we'd like to see those restrictions lifted and have people be able to access travel more economically and be able to get out there and visit friends and family and connect again.
Great, thanks for that. So the question I have for you is sort of, and you touched on this a bit in your remarks about entering the Austin market, Austin, Texas market, is, I'm curious, like going forward, hopefully we're back to something, it's going to be different. Things are going to be different. But when you think about growth opportunities, when you look out at the world, what seems most, are there certain opportunities that stand out? Like I'll ask about two places in particular. So there's obviously mainland US, but first is Canada. I see, Peter, that you're from Canada, but you guys don't fly to Canada. So I'm curious, I bet you would like to fly to Canada, being from a native Canadian. And then the second question is China. So I don't know, but and I'm not sure those are the right two places to flag as growth opportunities. Maybe the Austin, Texas's, or cranking up the number of flights to Seattle or something, are more the growth opportunities rather than those two places. But thoughts on that?
Yeah, I'll talk about both of those, and then I'll talk about some of the things I see domestically. We did fly to China between 2014 and 2018. It proved to be very challenging. I think there is ultimately the case for why China is going to be an important source of visitors to Hawaii in the long term is going to prove true. But it was far too early, and particularly when you hit periods where it's very difficult for people to get a visa for travel, that's just an impediment that is very difficult to overcome. And there are places that Chinese travelers can go that there's just less friction than there is to the United States today. Canada is an opportunity for us. It remains a white spot on our map of, if you look at where visitors come to Hawaii today. I think we would certainly like to try that one day. One of the things that I think is sort of interesting to see how it plays out post-pandemic, and as we've had a year where so many of our activities and behaviors were altered, it will be fascinating to see, how many of those behaviors stick in the long term. One of them is around business travel, and having interactions like this on Zoom. Is that going to stifle business travel for longer? And I think that's an open question, but certainly leisure is absolutely leading the recovery right now. Business is obviously not a big part of our addressable market, but that is important for many of our competitors. The other thing is remote work more broadly, and people moving further away from places like the Bay Area and working in different places through a remote basis. If that continues, there may be some previous smaller markets that had not enough demand to justify a nonstop flight to Honolulu, but may, over time, as the population rebalances, may have different demands. And people may, now that they can work remotely, some of our day of week patterns may be different, where people will travel on a Wednesday, work remotely Thursday, Friday, and enjoy a long weekend, as opposed to so much of the demand being, focused on Fridays and Sundays or Mondays, where we're very oriented around a physical working relationship and a 5-day work week.
Great, thanks for that. And we have so many great questions from the audience. So I'm sorry if you sent in a question and I didn't get it in, but I'm gonna ask one more question. I know we're basically at time, but maybe Peter and or Larry, you can quickly answer this, and then I'll thank you both. Could you elaborate a bit on the economic impact of embracing Hawaiian culture and identity? What effect that's had on Hawaiian Airlines? Your airline has branded itself with a unique identity that stands out in an industry that offers pretty much the exact same product, air travel. So can you talk a bit about that?
So let me make a couple comments, and then again let Peter Peter, who deals with everyday talk, but since becoming involved with Hawaiian in 2005, one of the things that I'm just most proud of is how good I think our product is. And that really comes mostly from the people we have. And I will tell you, the aloha spirit is a very real thing. And it's perhaps become a little more difficult as we've grown, but over the years, I would just say our frontline people, and especially our flight attendants, just come from a culture that's warm and elegant and just very pleasant. And it really, I think, makes our job that much easier, because the folks that we interact with in Hawaii just generally want to deliver a product they're proud of and are warm, and just are warm folks. So I've always been really impressed by that and really proud of the product. I think it's a really important part of what we do. Peter, why don't you talk a bit about that?
Yeah, it's something that is incredibly important to us, and in an industry where there is a tendency sometime for people to think of it as a commodity, it's important, particularly when you're a smaller airline, to seek opportunities to truly differentiate and be unique. And you know, our purpose, well, we've worked with our employees to identify what our purpose is, and really focus on it, is to connect people with aloha. And that means something to the people who work here, 90% of whom live in Hawaii. The vast majority, unlike myself, were not only live here, but are born and raised here. And it really is something that our guests care about, because when they're looking to travel to Hawaii or within Hawaii, they've already expressed an affinity for the Hawaiian culture, and we're in a unique position to be able to deliver an authentic sense of that in our airline experience. We've obviously got to have competitive costs. We've got to be able to provide the hard product elements that people like, but delivering it with an authentic hospitality and caring is something that we think can allow us to separate ourselves from the other airlines that are flying to Hawaii, and is really important for us to embrace and maintain and try and nurture going forward.
Well, thank you both so much for making time for this today. I know, I speak for pretty much everyone in the SIEPR family that we really appreciate. We know you're both super busy, and really appreciate you making time to share with us your insights on this very important industry that's been so disrupted by the pandemic, but also to get us all thinking about Hawaii. And I personally have already checked out and see that 8 months from yesterday is the Honolulu Marathon. The last time I ran that was 1998. But it's inspired me to think hard about doing it again this December 12th. So I might just be right across the street from you soon, Peter, when I fly in on Hawaiian Air, hopefully to Honolulu in December. But thank you so much for being with us today. And thanks to all of you for tuning in. And it was so nice to connect with you, and hope to see all of you again soon. But Larry and Peter, thank you. Thank you again for all of us, from all of us.
Thank you. Great to be with you all.
Take care, everybody.